Hey friends, welcome to this short course covering the foundations of a contemplative life. So when I first started leaning into a more contemplative life, honestly, I felt a little bit lost. Like I didn't grow up with any framework for contemplation or what some traditions would call meditation. I'll refer to it with more language around contemplative practices. Really, I had no real framework for any contemplative practices or any practices that would help me pay deeper attention to my life with God. So I'd never been in a church that practiced liturgy in the way that I now understand liturgy. And really the only prayers that I ever prayed growing up were prayers that I made up. They were extemporaneous prayers, as we say. It's how most people talk about prayer. Like mostly, I just prayed about the things that were happening in my life or in the life of other people. So my only concept of prayer was to pray really what was in my heart. And honestly, this is actually a really great place to start. But nobody really ever talked to me about the work of prayer that seeks to pay deeper attention to what's happening inside of me. And it's really taken some practice for me to be able to settle into some more restful forms of prayers and rhythms. And so when I began to explore this more contemplative posture in my faith, when I first started out, I just started making stuff up. I just started inventing things. I started exploring ways to pray differently, trying to pay attention to what I was actually getting after. And I created new ways to lean into rhythms of prayer. And one of the things that I did in college, for example, was that I divided up the Psalms into 30 days where each day I would pray 5 Psalms in an effort to sort of have something that I could sort of have some rails to run on to give me some structure. What I didn't know is that this work had already been done for me, that men and women had been praying like this for over 1,000 years, praying at fixed hours throughout the day and into the night, praying words that were written down, that other people had actually written in regular rhythms. There were so many resources that were available to me. I just didn't know anything about them. There were books like the Book of the Common Prayer from the Anglican tradition, and there were rhythms of prayer carried through the tradition of monks and nuns following the rule of St. Benedict, prayers that would help me center my life and quiet my heart, center on God's love or God's presence. And so as I've continued to learn more about this tradition over the past 15 or so years, I've discovered that so many times when I would get curious about this more contemplative tradition, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about in the next video, every time I would get curious about something, the things that I was looking for were actually really accessible to me. But I actually had to reach outside of the tradition that I had first come to faith within. There are so many things that I have found really helpful within the historic witness of the church. And I want to welcome you into this course, which we've called a Contemplative Foundation. My name is Jared Boyd, and I'm the founder of the Order of the Common Life. And we're a 21st century religious order rooted in historic monasticism. And some of the work that we're trying to do is we're trying to reimagine what religious orders could look like in and for our time. And one of the ways that I describe the work of the order would be to ask you to maybe imagine the Franciscans or the Jesuits or even Mother Teresa's order called the Sisters of Charity. You might be more familiar with that one. All of these are in the Catholic tradition, by the way. But I want you to imagine if these religious orders were birthed in the 21st century, and more specifically, imagine that they came out of the renewal movement of the 1970s, the Jesus movement, which saw a great deal of the charismatic gifts emerge, the gifts of the Spirit. So the Order of the Common Life was birthed out of the tradition of the Vineyard movement, which comes from that Jesus movement. And it takes really seriously the reality that God very much still speaks to us today, that God can speak to us in dreams and through the prophetic tradition, that God can show up in a moment, in just like a moment right now, and bring his presence. And all of these things within the tradition of the Vineyard movement are moments when the kingdom of God breaks into this world. Like right now, it's coming right now. Like God does something in a moment through his presence in the world, in my life, in your life, and that we can see this sort of unfolding and spilling out. So this conviction that sometimes God's presence shows up with great power in these moments, paired with the conviction that God also shows up in really slow ways, like in silence, and in long and slow conversations of prayer over time, in growing over long periods of time, in our ability to see our own lives and our own selves as we truly are before God. These more contemplative practices can also bring great healing and deliverance and real health to our lives. That's been my experience. So, friends, in so many ways, what we're trying to nurture is the reality that the presence of God is real. It's real in the charismatic ways that we might encounter at a conference, in a big room, with worship. The presence of God is real in the contemplative tradition through prayers of silence and rest and Lectio Divina, which is a prayerful, meditative way of reading the scriptures. And the presence of God is real in the sacraments, specifically the sacrament of Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, as some traditions might call it. And we can grow in our ability to pay attention to how the presence of God shows up in our lives. And this course provides a very basic foundation to some practices within that contemplative tradition. So our primary mission is to help you notice and nurture the work of God in your life, in the lives of those around you. And we believe that ultimately this leads to a life of being able to do that work of noticing the work of God out there into the world. And so it becomes missional. So friends, whatever we can do to help serve you in your spiritual journey, in your apprenticeship to the way of Jesus, in maybe actually in your deconstruction and reconstruction of what all of that means for you. Maybe there's some of you that are walking through some discernment or some decision-making in your life. Friends, we just want to serve you in whatever way that we would be helpful to you. That's our heart with the Order of the Common Life. And so this short course, which is made up of 8 movements, is designed to introduce you to our way of life together. Like, we want to give you some foundational practices that we lean into together as members of the Order of the Common Life, which we hope will give you some tools in your journey into the contemplative life and into this contemplative tradition that we have found so much life in. So our hope with you in this course is that you would learn some basic practices for a more contemplative journey in your life of following after Jesus. And that you would recognize that this is not work that you have to do by yourself. Like, there's a whole community of people who are leaning in the same direction into that contemplative life. And you can be part of something much bigger than just making little adjustments that you might want to make with your prayer life. You can actually be part of a bigger community of people and that are doing all of this work together. It's much bigger than just shifting your own individual rhythms. Like, you can do all of this work, all of these practices within the Christian tradition. You can do all of this alongside of others, and this is how it was always meant to be. And this is actually the foundation of the monastic life and the way of life of religious orders that have sprung up since men and women first began to share in spiritual life together in community. So religious orders, like the Order of the Common Life, recognize that each of us has our own individual spirituality and our own individual practices, but that something truly does happen when we lean into that life alongside of others who are leaning in the same direction. That's our heart for you, and that's what we do together as an order. And this is not to say that this is going to look exactly the same for everybody. Some of you are here, for example, in preparation for a 6-month discernment process that explores the concept of a rule of life. And some of you are here simply to lean into some deeper spiritual practices, maybe discover some new spiritual friendships along the way within what we call the community of the common life. Friends, whatever reason you're here for is totally fine. Like, we really want you to know that you do not have to journey in your life with God by yourself. And I think actually we can help with that. Okay, I think that's good for now. We've got one more short introductory video before you get started. We just want to welcome you to a Contemplative Foundation. Blessings to you.